In the heart of the most brutal winter on record, a lone settler defied nature's fiercest forces. With snow piling high and the cold so deep it cut through flesh, he engineered a way to stop the cold from creeping inside his cabin, forever changing the survival tactics of those brave enough to live in the wilderness. Before we dive into this incredible survival story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you're fascinated by tales of ingenuity and resilience, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will leave you in awe of human determination. The winter of 1856 had set in with a vicious bite, colder and longer than any settler in the region could remember. The snow, relentless and deep, blanketed everything in sight, leaving only the stark silhouettes of trees and the occasional structure to break the endless white expanse. Among these structures stood a log cabin nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, its stone chimney pluming smoke that spiraled upward into the pale sky. Inside, a man named Jacob Hartley sat by the fire, his breath visible in the freezing air. The wind howled through the cracks in the log walls, and the chill seeped into his bones despite the warmth of the flames. Jacob had lived through countless winters in the mountains, but this one was different. No amount of firewood seemed to keep the warmth in, and the drafts, no matter how many times he patched them up, kept finding new ways to creep through. It wasn't just his cabin. The entire settlement had been battling the same issue. For weeks, Jacob had been grappling with the cold. The traditional methods of insulation, the thick logs and packed moss, were proving useless against the harshest winter the land had seen in years. His neighbors, hardy men and women accustomed to the brutal realities of frontier life, were also struggling. Their homes, like his own, were built with the best materials they had, logs from the surrounding forests, stone from nearby hills, but no structure, no matter how well crafted, seemed immune to the bone-chilling winds of the Rockies. One evening, as Jacob sat huddled near the fire, his eyes caught sight of the eaves of his cabin, where the snow had begun to form thick layers. He had seen this before, the way the snow would melt slightly during the day and refreeze at night. It was an issue that affected every cabin in the area, with roofs sagging under the weight and drafts sneaking in through the poorly sealed edges. The thought struck him then, what if the key to keeping the cold out wasn't just the cabin's walls or roof, but how the structure interacted with the environment? Could he stop the cold from even touching the edges of his home? Jacob's mind began to race. He recalled the principles of heat retention he had learned as a child, the way heat rises and how the flow of air could either keep a home warm or suck the heat right back out. He had heard whispers from fellow settlers about designs used in colder, more extreme climates, ways to prevent the cold from even touching the edges of a home. The key, he thought, might lie in the eaves. He spent the next few days observing the way the snow gathered on the roof. With every gust of wind, it was clear the snow would pile up near the edges, forming a thick, almost impermeable barrier. What if he could use that natural buildup of snow to his advantage? What if the snow could act as insulation rather than a threat? He had little time to lose. The next storm was forecast to be even worse than the last. Jacob worked through the night, constructing a new plan for his cabin's roofline. He had seen similar designs in more northern settlements, but it would be a first in these parts. His idea was simple but ambitious. He would modify the eaves, using the snow itself as an insulator. He envisioned the snow settling not just on the roof, but along the edges, sealed in place by a clever construction that would trap it where it fell, preventing the wind from whipping it away and allowing it to act as a barrier against the cold. The next day, he gathered his tools, an old hatchet, a saw, and an assortment of nails and wooden beams. His hands were numb as he worked, but the plan consumed him. He began by reinforcing the edges of the roof, adding a small lip along the eaves to keep the snow in place. He then constructed a series of barriers that would keep the snow packed tightly against the cabin, preventing the wind from stripping it away as it had with past storms. As he worked, Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was attempting. He had no guarantees that his plan would work. The cold had defeated far more seasoned settlers than him. But he couldn't sit idly by while his home continued to be threatened by the elements. There was no option but to try something new. By the end of the week, Jacob had finished his work. The eaves were lined with a thick layer of snow, carefully packed into place by the structure he had built. It wasn't just a roof anymore. It had become a barrier. A cold stop that would, he hoped, hold back the worst of the winter's bite. That night, another storm arrived. Jacob stood outside, looking at the cabin, as the first flakes began to fall. He felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty, but he had done all he could. He returned inside, stoked the fire, and watched as the snow began to settle on the new roofline. As the storm raged outside, Jacob Hartley sat by the fire, feeling the warmth of the cabin for the first time in weeks. The cold was no longer seeping in from the edges. The air inside the cabin felt different, warmer still. He knew that come morning he would see if the storm had proven his work to be worth the risk. If his experiment worked, it wouldn't just be his cabin that was saved. It would be an idea that could transform the way settlers built homes in the harshest winters. The storm howled through the valley, the wind battering the cabin's walls with a ferocity Jacob had not seen in years. Snow piled up faster than it could be shoveled away, burying the landscape in a thick, impenetrable layer. Inside the cabin, however, the air felt different. For the first time in weeks, Jacob didn't have to huddle close to the fire, his breath visible in the air, to feel warmth. The wind, as fierce as it was, couldn't reach him. He watched from the window as the snow accumulated around the eaves. The new snow-packed lip he had constructed held firm, creating a solid barrier against the wind. It was working. The wind no longer swept through the edges of the roof, and the cold seemed to stay outside, where it belonged. But that night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, eyes wide open, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just the cold that he was fighting now, it was his legacy. If his cold stop eaves worked, he would have discovered something that could change the way the settlers lived through the harshest winters. But if it failed, he'd only be left with another failed experiment and a winter that would cost him more than he could afford to lose. The storm continued through the night. By morning, the wind had died down, and the snow had finally begun to settle. Jacob pulled on his thick fur-lined boots, his hands stiff from the cold. He stepped outside, his breath a cloud in the air. The world around him was blanketed in white, the snowflakes drifting lazily to the ground. He walked to the edge of his cabin, inspecting the snow that had accumulated on the roof. The snow was still tightly packed in place, not scattered or blown away as it had been in previous storms. His heart lifted slightly. He ran his hand along the newly constructed eaves, the thick layer of snow holding strong. As he stood there, admiring his work, a new realization hit him. The snow was doing more than just blocking the cold. It was creating insulation. The deeper the snow pile, the more the cold was trapped outside, while the heat from inside the cabin stayed inside. The sun began to rise higher in the sky, and Jacob spent the rest of the morning shoveling a path to the barn. His mind was preoccupied, thinking of the implications of what he had just discovered. The cold stop eaves were more than just an idea to keep the wind out. They were a new way to build for the future. If this system worked, it could not only help him survive the winter, but give other settlers a chance to thrive in the toughest conditions. The coming weeks would be the true test. Could the snow continue to act as a barrier against the cold? Would it hold up under even harsher conditions? Jacob didn't know, but he was determined to find out. By the time December rolled around, the entire valley had experienced the worst winter storm in decades. Jacob's cold stop eaves had held up against nature's might, but now the real challenge began. His neighbors, once skeptical of his odd construction techniques, had started to take notice. The settlers who had mocked Jacob's obsession with snow-packed eaves now found themselves envious of the warmth his cabin maintained. Some had tried patching their own cabins, but it wasn't the same. None of them had the thick snow barrier that Jacob had created. Jacob knew word would spread, But he wasn't prepared for the number of people who showed up at his cabin in the following days. One by one, settlers from nearby cabins trekked through the deep snow to see for themselves what Jacob had done. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation. At first they watched from a distance, unwilling to approach too closely. The cold had made everyone cautious, but Jacob welcomed them. There was no pride in this survival. There was only the will to make it through. As they stood around the fire in his cabin, watching the flames crackle and pop, Jacob could sense the shift in their attitudes. They were no longer looking at him as a mere eccentric. They were looking at him as someone who had discovered a solution. "How'd you do it?" one of the men, William, asked. His face was covered in frost, and his nose was red from the cold, but his eyes held genuine curiosity. Jacob stood up and walked over to the window, pointing toward the roof. "It's simple," he said, his voice low but steady. "The eaves, the way the snow packs in, it's natural insulation. It stops the wind from breaking through. The snow builds a barrier, one that keeps the cold from reaching the walls." William nodded slowly, taking in the information. "I've seen snow build up like that on the roof, but I never thought of it that way." Jacob smiled faintly. No one did until now. The men began to talk among themselves, discussing the possibility of using the same technique on their cabins. Jacob watched them, sensing the wheels turning in their minds. There was a hunger for survival here, a shared desire to thrive in a world that demanded nothing less than ingenuity. His cabin, once a solitary experiment, was now the hub of a growing movement, a movement that could change the way they all survived in the harsh wilderness. By the time the sun set that evening, Jacob had agreed to help several of the settlers with their own cold-stop eaves. Some would need help reinforcing their roofs. Others had already started to shovel snow into place, eager to see if Jacob's idea could truly work for them. Jacob felt a wave of pride and anxiety wash over him. This wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. This was about transforming the way people in the valley thought about survival. As his neighbors filed out into the night, each carrying with them a glimmer of hope, Jacob realized that for the first time in weeks, the harsh winter no longer seemed like the enemy. The cold, once an insurmountable force, was now something they could manage, something they could conquer together. As the weeks passed, the winter showed no signs of relenting. The cold deepened, and the snow piled higher with each passing storm. Jacob had spent the last month helping the neighboring settlers reinforce their eaves, teaching them how to pack the snow in such a way that it would act as insulation against the bitter winds. While some of them were eager learners, others remained hesitant, skeptical of the new method. Jacob had expected resistance. People were used to the old ways of doing things, and change, especially in a place as unforgiving as the mountains, was not something to be taken lightly. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Jacob couldn't help but notice a pattern. The settlers who had adopted his method were faring better than those who had stuck with their traditional cabins. They came to Jacob's cabin often, exchanging stories about how the cold was no longer creeping into their homes, how their fires lasted longer, how they could sit by the hearth without feeling the biting chill at their backs. But there were others who remained cautious, questioning the new design, unsure if it would truly withstand the weight of the winter. William, one of the first to adopt the cold-stop eaves, had already come back twice for assistance. Once when the snow had settled in too thick, and another when the lip of the eaves had begun to crack under the heavy load. The truth was, the cold-stop method was far from perfect. While it worked better than traditional methods, it wasn't foolproof. There were moments when the snow became too heavy, or when the wind blew so hard that the snow packed in the eaves became uneven, letting some cold seep through. These imperfections made Jacob worry. Was it really the solution they all needed, or was it just a temporary fix, a lucky break in an otherwise harsh season? One evening, as Jacob worked alone by the fire, his thoughts turned to the growing divide between the settlers who had embraced the idea and those who had not. The cabin walls were lined with smoke-blackened logs, and the wind howled through the cracks in the ceiling. Jacob's cabin was warm, but in the silence, he felt the weight of his decision to share this idea with others. What if the worst was yet to come? The following day, as another storm rolled in, Jacob received an unexpected visit. It was William again, looking more haggard than usual, his face red and raw from the cold. "I've got a problem," William said as he stepped inside, shaking off the snow. "The snow's packed in too tightly. It's starting to slide off, and the roof's getting weighed down. It's not holding up like it should." Jacob studied his friend's face. He could see the worry in his eyes. "I'll come and take a look," he said, grabbing his coat. The two of them trudged through the thick snow, making their way to William's cabin. When they arrived, Jacob immediately saw the issue. The snow had indeed become too compacted in places, leaving pockets of air and causing the eaves to sag. The cold had begun creeping in once again, this time from the very system he had created to block it out. "How long has it been like this?" Jacob asked. "A few days," William replied, his voice strained. "It's only getting worse." Jacob frowned, trying to come up with a solution. The snow was supposed to hold, but the winter was showing its relentless power once more. He spent the next few hours helping William adjust the snow-packed eaves, using his tools to carve new lips and edges along the roof, reinforcing the system where the weight had become too much. By the time they finished, the cabin was sealed again, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a temporary solution. The wind was picking up again, and the storm was worsening. As they returned to Jacob's cabin, William looked over at him. "You think this is enough?" he asked. Jacob hesitated. "It's enough for now, but we need to keep an eye on it. The snow, it's too unpredictable. But I'll work on a better design. We can't afford to leave any gaps." As they parted ways, Jacob couldn't help but feel a growing sense of doubt. The cold stop eaves had worked, but the perfect solution was still out of reach. How could he make it stronger, more permanent, before the worst of the winter arrived? By late January, the storms had become nearly constant. The snow was deeper than ever, the cold more biting. Jacob had spent the last few weeks adjusting the cold stop eaves in various cabins, but each time he patched one flaw, another would reveal itself. The snow would shift, the weight would be uneven, or the wind would blow too hard, carrying the snow off the roof before it could settle properly. His confidence, once steady, was starting to waver. But then, one afternoon, as he sat alone in his cabin, an idea struck him. A new way to reinforce the snow and make the design more reliable. The key, he realized, was not just the snow, but the way it was held in place. He needed to add a layer of protection that would prevent the snow from sliding or being moved by the wind. The answer, as simple as it was, had been in front of him the entire time. Jacob grabbed his tools and set to work. He began by reinforcing the roof further, using long wooden slats to create a web-like structure over the snow-packed eaves. This would give the snow something to cling to, holding it in place no matter how harsh the storm. He worked into the evening, shaping the slats carefully, ensuring they were securely fastened to the roof. When he finished, Jacob stood back and surveyed his work. The slats were snug against the roof, but they didn't block the snow from settling in. In fact, they would help trap the snow more effectively, preventing the wind from stealing it away. It was an elegant solution, one that had been right there all along. Jacob felt a wave of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, he believed he had found a design that would stand the test of time. The next day, Jacob invited William over to see the new setup. William had been helping with the other cabins in the area, but even he couldn't deny the promise of Jacob's new solution. "I've got something to show you," Jacob said, his voice filled with anticipation. Together, they inspected the new design, Jacob explaining how the slats would work, in tandem with the snow, ensuring it stayed in place and blocked the cold. William was impressed. "This might just work," he said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "This could be the breakthrough we've all been waiting for." Jacob nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. If this worked, it could change everything. No longer would they need to fear the bitter cold of the mountains. Together, they had found a way to outmart the winter. By the first week of February, the winter's grip was tightening. Snow had accumulated to depths that could swallow a horse, and the wind seemed to howl without pause, rattling the walls of every cabin. Jacob had completed the final adjustments to the cold-stop Eaves system, reinforcing the roofs of several cabins with the wooden slats he had crafted. The new design, he believed, was the answer to the weaknesses of the original plan. It would hold the snow in place, preventing it from sliding off in the harshest storms. He hoped it would make the difference. The first test came on the evening of February 4th. A storm of unprecedented proportions descended on the valley, the skies darkening as the winds picked up. Snowflakes, driven by the gusting winds, spun in all directions, and the air temperature plummeted. Jacob could feel the unease settling in his gut as he watched the storm from his cabin window. He knew the storm would test not only the integrity of his cabin, but also his newfound solution. As the storm raged outside, Jacob sat close to the fire, his thoughts turning to the settlers who had adopted the cold-stop Eaves. How would they fare tonight? Would the snow hold, or would the system break under the weight? He had made a promise to them, and now he felt the weight of that promise more than ever before. Hours passed, and the wind continued to batter the cabin. The chimney smoke swirled and disappeared into the freezing night air, a stark contrast to the warmth within. Jacob couldn't relax. Every crack and creak of the cabin's walls seemed magnified, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break it apart. He stood up and grabbed his coat. The storm was worsening, and he needed to check on the other cabins. If his system failed, there would be no time to waste. He stepped outside, the snow immediately up to his knees, and began walking toward the nearest cabin. The wind cut through him, biting at his skin, but he kept moving. His breath fogged in the air, and each step was a struggle against the deep snow. It was as if nature itself was trying to stop him. But Jacob pressed on, determined to ensure that his work was holding up. When he reached William's cabin, the sight that greeted him was better than he had dared hope. The snow on the roof, held in place by the new slats, was untouched by the wind. It had settled thickly, providing a layer of insulation that was keeping the cold at bay. He could see the soft glow of light from inside, a sign that the fire was still burning and that the heat wasn't escaping through any gaps. Inside, William greeted him with a relieved smile. "It's working, Jacob," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I thought it might give out, but it's holding firm." Jacob nodded, unable to hide the relief in his expression. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a victory. The storm raged through the night, but when Jacob returned to his cabin the next morning, he found the same sight. His cold-stop eaves had withstood the worst the storm had thrown at them. Snow remained packed tightly in place along the roof's edge, preventing the wind from pushing it off. The cold had stayed outside, and warmth remained inside. The new design had passed the first true test. Jacob realized, for the first time, that the cold-stop Eaves system was not just a survival tool for him. It was a revolution for all those who dared to live in the mountains, offering them a fighting chance against the most relentless winters. As the winter stretched into March, the valley began to show signs of thawing. The days grew longer, the sun rising higher in the sky, yet the cold still held its grip, and Jacob knew that the coming weeks would bring more tests. But with the success of the cold-stop Eaves in the last storm, he felt a renewed sense of hope, for himself, for his neighbors, and for the future of those living on the frontier. Word of the cold-stop Eaves had spread like wildfire. Settlers from surrounding areas began to make the journey to Jacob's cabin, eager to see the new method in action and learn how to apply it to their own homes. Jacob had become a reluctant teacher, but he embraced the role with quiet pride. He knew that his invention wasn't just a chance for survival in the present, it was the beginning of a new way of life for frontier settlers. It would allow them to build stronger, warmer homes, endure winters that had once seemed impossible, and face the harsh landscape with a sense of confidence that had previously been out of reach. One morning, Jacob was greeted by a group of settlers who had traveled from a nearby valley. They had heard of his methods and wanted to see for themselves if the cold-stop eaves were truly a solution. As Jacob demonstrated the design, explaining the intricacies of the snow-packed eaves and the wooden slats, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It was one thing to survive. It was another to change the way an entire community approached survival. As the settlers watched, Jacob realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. The cold-stop eaves were more than just an invention. They were a symbol of perseverance. In a world that often seemed determined to break them, Jacob and his fellow settlers had found a way to fight back. They had used the land to their advantage, not just surviving, but thriving. But the journey was far from over. Jacob still had much to learn, and there would be further challenges ahead. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. His invention had worked, but more importantly, it had given others the tools to succeed. No longer was survival a matter of luck. It was a matter of intelligence, community, and resilience. As the last of the snow melted and the first signs of spring began to appear, Jacob knew that he had contributed something vital to the frontier. His cold-stop eaves had not just protected his cabin from the ravages of the winter, they had provided a new foundation upon which the future of the mountain settlers could be built. They now had a way to endure what had once seemed impossible. Jacob stood on the porch of his cabin, looking out over the valley. The storm clouds had passed and the sun was beginning to peek through. He could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of nearby cabins, each of them now protected from the bitter winds that had once threatened to destroy them. The wilderness was still harsh, but for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt at peace. As the warmth of spring gradually crept over the valley, Jacob found himself reflecting on the winter that had passed. The cold-stop eaves had proven successful, but the summer brought new challenges. The melting snow revealed the limitations of the design. Jacob had never anticipated that the same snow that had acted as a shield in the winter months could become an obstacle in the thawing spring. The first issue became apparent when the snow began to melt off the roofs. In some areas, the wooden slats that had reinforced the snow-packed eaves started to warp, weakened by the water runoff. The snow, which had acted as insulation and a wind barrier, now posed a risk of water damage as it melted and seeped into the roof structure. Jacob watched as the water began to drip from the edge of the roof, pooling in the ground below. And his heart sank. He realized that the very thing that had saved the cabins from the winter cold might now pose a danger of its own. A long, slow trickle that could lead to leaks and, eventually, structural damage if not addressed. As Jacob walked along the cabins, inspecting the damage, he found that the water runoff had caused some of the wooden slats to rot. They were holding up, but he could see the slow degradation beginning to take its toll. Jacob had never considered the possibility of water damage from snowmelt, but it was now a problem he could no longer ignore. The solution that had saved the settlers from the worst winter in living memory was now at risk of becoming a liability in the changing season. He spent the next several weeks trying to come up with a new solution. The concept was simple. How could he prevent the melting snow from damaging the roofs? He experimented with ways to direct the runoff, using gutters and small channels to redirect the water away from the roof and walls. His first attempt, using makeshift gutters made of wood, was unsuccessful. They were prone to clogging, and the water quickly spilled over, creating a mess. But Jacob wasn't one to give up easily. After a few failures, he devised a more permanent system using copper piping, a material that would not rot and could withstand the weather better than wood. The new system worked better, but it was far from perfect. The copper pipes were expensive, and the settlers didn't have access to enough of the material to implement the system on every cabin in the area. Jacob began to think about the long-term solution, a way to incorporate the snow-stop eaves into every home without relying too heavily on copper or metal parts. There was still work to be done, but Jacob had learned an important lesson. The wilderness always finds a way to challenge even the best-laid plans. As the months passed, Jacob's cold-stop eaves continued to evolve. The spring had tested his invention in unexpected ways, but Jacob was not deterred. Each failure, each setback was a chance to refine his work and make it better. What had started as a simple idea to keep the cold out had turned into something far more substantial, a life-saving invention that was changing the way settlers built their homes in the harsh wilderness. Word of Jacob's work continued to spread, and settlers from farther afield began to arrive, eager to learn how to implement the cold-stop eaves. Jacob had become a quiet leader in the community, not through force or authority, but through his ingenuity and perseverance. He had shown others that survival was not just about enduring the wilderness, but about adapting and finding ways to thrive within it. But even as his work helped others, Jacob's thoughts often returned to the question of legacy. The cold-stop eaves were a significant achievement, but would they be remembered? Would his name be passed down, or would his work fade into the shadows of history like so many unsung pioneers? He thought of his father, who had been a skilled carpenter, and of the many other men and women who had come before him, working tirelessly to build a future in the frontier. Jacob realized that it wasn't the recognition that mattered. It was the fact that his work had made a difference, not just for him, but for everyone who had adopted his methods. One afternoon, as Jacob walked through the valley, he stopped at a cabin where a family had recently implemented the cold-stop eaves. The family was gathered around the fire, and Jacob could see the warmth in their eyes as they chatted, comfortable in their home, despite the chill of the autumn air. The mother waved to him from inside, calling him over to join them. "Jacob, come in. We've been meaning to thank you for everything you've done for us," she said, her smile warm and inviting. Jacob stepped inside, greeted by the flickering light of the fire and the comfortable warmth that filled the room. He sat down by the hearth, feeling the heat from the fire seep into his bones, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. His work had made a real difference. The cabin was snug, the wind and cold no longer creeping in, and the family was safe. "How's the cabin holding up?" Jacob asked. "Perfectly," the father replied, his voice full of gratitude. "The cold doesn't get in anymore. We sleep warm, even on the coldest nights. You've saved us more than you know." Jacob smiled, looking around the room at the happy faces. This was what mattered. The people who had found a way to live better in a place that didn't care if they survived. It wasn't the copper pipes or the snow-stop eaves that mattered in the end. It was the people who lived with them, who had built their lives in the wilderness with a little help from the lessons Jacob had learned the hard way. As he left the cabin, Jacob looked out at the valley, the mountains standing tall in the distance. His work wasn't finished, and he knew there would always be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that his legacy was secure. The cold-stop eaves had changed the frontier, not with a grand gesture, but with simple, enduring innovation. And that, Jacob realized, was more than enough. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Jacob turned to head back to his cabin, knowing that the next winter would bring new challenges, but also knowing that, together, they could face whatever came their way. His work had made a lasting impact, and as long as there were settlers to live in the valley, his legacy would continue to shelter them from the storms of life.